only mode.
Hello everybody, this is Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools and welcome to our session today on SharePoint Permissions Management, and we're going to be taking a look at permissions management both in SharePoint Online as well as SharePoint on-premises. So first of all, if you're not familiar with who the company is, then we're a company that's been around for about 12 years now, and we offer products that fill gaps inside Microsoft SharePoint, and they range from business connectivity services, tooling, so we can connect to almost endless data sources to bring data into Microsoft SharePoint through a user-friendly design tool. We've also got a discussion forum product called Social Squared, which provides you with an enterprise discussion forum tool that you can use contextually within inside of SharePoint and SharePoint Online. Of course, the permissions management tool that we'll be talking about today, and it's not just about the tool, but also around SharePoint permissions in general and some of the new features of permissions in SharePoint Online as well. And we also offer tooling around content aggregation, data visualization, and also we have a product which is called Lining Forms, which allows you to customize SharePoint list forms to provide better layout and logic to those forms, which makes a great InfoPath replacement. So my name is Brett Lonsdale. I'm a SharePoint MVP and also among other things besides running Lightning Tools, I'm one of the hosts of a podcast called Texplaining, where you can hear us speaking about different technologies around Office 365 and also SharePoint on-prem. And also I've authored a couple of books as well around business connectivity services in the business data catalog. So Lightning Tools, we're a company, as mentioned, we provide tools around Microsoft SharePoint, and we always innovate those products. We're on our third platform for a lot of our tools, and if you keep an eye out for upcoming webinars, you'll see that we're relaunching all of our products under the SharePoint framework currently. That includes our content aggregator, the Lightning Adapter, and also the Data Viewer and Social Squared. So we're innovating the products all the time. They're simple to use, they perform well, and they're backed by outstanding, knowledgeable customer service as well. So what we want to look at is the first of all the agenda, so you understand what we're going to be exploring today. And what I want to address first of all is the common pain points that we have around Microsoft SharePoint permissions. And this is feedback that we've received from quite a large customer base over the years with regards to permissions. So what I want to focus on is, first of all, what problems are our customers facing with regards to managing and reporting on permissions. And then we're also going to have a look at how permissions are changing in SharePoint. And this is the first time really since SharePoint 2003 that I've really seen quite a dramatic change in the way that permissions work. And that's with the introduction of the Office 365 SharePoint Online modern sites. And specifically, I'm talking about hub sites and associated sites, and how we're sort of moving away from having this hierarchy of a site collection to having a flat hierarchy with sites that are just simply associated with each other. And through those modern sites, what changes are we looking at with regards to permissions, and how are they affected? So we'll be focusing on that as well. And sure, there's been a few subtle changes over the years with regards to permissions, but really what I'm talking about is quite a shift in how we manage those permissions. And of course, we're going to have a look at how DeliverPoint can be used to address a lot of those issues, not just for the SharePoint Farm administrator or the tenant administrator if you use SharePoint Online, but also for the business user as well. So perhaps if you've got site collection administrators or site owners that are tasked with managing permissions and making sure that permissions on their content is an optimum, then that's the sort of thing that our tooling can help with, and that's what I'm keen to show you today. There's going to be lots of opportunity for you to ask questions as well. So at the end, I'll open up for Q&A. At some point, if you want to make sure that you're you've got a mic ready to speak, what you can do towards the end is raise your hand using the GoToWebinar software, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question. And if you haven't got the ability to use mic, or you're too shy to talk in front of an audience, which I believe me, I understand. Feel free to drop me an email, and I'll give you those email details towards the end of the webinar here today. Okay, so 5 common pain points is what we're going to focus on. If you ask anybody about permissions, then the first thing they typically say is the share button. And I don't think it's the share button itself. Nobody's really got anything against a button, but it's more about what that share button does. And in reality, we don't really have anything new here. In fact, the share button was introduced in SharePoint 2013, so it's not actually that new. It's still relatively new when we look at the life of SharePoint since the beginning of the millennium. So the problem with the share button is it's something that is there at the site level. It's also there inside a list, and it's also there inside our list items as well. It's very easy to click on to share and to share the content, whether it's the site, the list item, document folder, whatever, with a colleague, or also if you use SharePoint Online, you can share it with an external user should external permissions be enabled. And one of the problems with that is the fact that item level permissions are often broken, and also it's perhaps not the best way for the business to be sharing content as well. So if, for instance, you were to share a site, when you click on to share and share that site, a request is going to be sent to either the site collection administrator or to somebody to approve the request. And when that email comes in, quite often it's just simply, yeah, that makes sense. This person is a sales user, they're requesting permissions to the sales team site. I'll just click on approve. And basically what you're doing is you're taking that user and you're putting them inside the members group of that site. That members group gets quite a high level of permissions. It gets edit permissions. And that's one of the challenges. You might not want your users to have edit permissions. You might want them to have contribute permissions. And there's things that you can do about that. But one important thing is the site permission inheritance is not broken. But if we take a look at item permissions, then we get a different behavior. If you click on to share at an item level or a folder level, and again, the request is accepted, you're basically breaking the permission inheritance on that item, and you're giving the user direct permissions to the item itself. And therein lies a much bigger problem, because that's what this graphic off to the right here is explaining. Is really we then start to get this needle in a haystack issue, that what happens if that user is to leave the organization or change roles inside the organization and so on? How do you possibly look at all of the access control lists for every single document, every folder inside your SharePoint environment? Okay, just bear with me one moment. Hopefully we're back here. Okay, slight glitch there. I'm not sure what quite happened. As we were saying, that we were talking about the share button. It's got different behaviors, whether it's at site level or at item level, and that leads to quite a bit of confusion. And then understanding who really has permissions to your content, what level of permissions do they have is another thing. Many organizations use Active Directory security groups in order to assign permissions to SharePoint. And if you're using Active Directory security groups, one of the challenges therefore is for the end user to manage permissions, because they don't truly understand who has access to their content. They can't enumerate these Active Directory groups, and quite often IT, as far as the SharePoint admin is concerned, they don't know who's in those groups either, and therefore we don't really know who can access the content, which quite possibly could be of a secure nature. There's also permission inheritance. How do we begin to understand where permission inheritance is broken and where is it inheriting permissions? Again, we've got this at site level, we've got it at list and library level, and also folders and documents and items. And if you're familiar with SharePoint lists and libraries already, and how to get to the permissions page for an item, it can take you around about 7 to 8 clicks, and that's if you know exactly what to click. If you're hunting around a little bit, then you're wasting a lot of time trying to just get to that permissions page, so you can check the permission inheritance on that document. That's not something that you can really afford time to do when you've got thousands of documents. So there's no way to also look at an individual across perhaps your whole site collection, or even if you're using SharePoint on premises, across web applications, or across the whole farm. And the reason why you might want to do that is what happens again if somebody leaves the organization or changes role. We want to understand what permissions they currently have, what groups are they a member of, and how do we take them out of all of those groups or take away all of their direct permissions in one go. And again, we'll be looking at how we can address that problem. And then the last point here is the SharePoint IT pros don't always know who should have permissions to your content. And really, that's why SharePoint is designed. SharePoint's designed for the business users to self-service. They can create sites, they can create lists and libraries, they can add columns inside those lists and libraries, and they can also manage the permissions. SharePoint wasn't designed really for central permissions management. It was designed for decentralized permissions management, i.e. your SharePoint users that have full control. They're the people that can manage permissions to the content, and you've also got other people that can manage group membership as well. So when you create a SharePoint group, you can add and remove people to those SharePoint groups, and you don't even need to have full control for that. So that's great because it's the departmental users, the business users, that know who should have access to that content in the first place. But are they given the right tooling, which is really what we're going to be focused on here in the demo. So also, as I mentioned, permissions are changing or have changed with the new modern sites, and I just want to make sure that you're still seeing my screen. Yeah, there we are. Okay, so so how have permissions changed? Well, if we look back at what we've always been doing, including SharePoint 2016 and SharePoint Online until we got these new modern sites, basically when you create a SharePoint team site, we obviously have to give it some thought about where are we going to create this team site? Whereabouts in the site collection are we going to create the team site? What's going to be the parent site when we create it? And as we're creating that new team site, we're giving careful thought to, well, do I want to inherit permissions or do I want to have unique permissions? And if I'm having unique permissions, then I've got another decision to make, and that's what groups do I want to create? So I create my owners group, my members group, and my visitors group. And once I've got those groups created, I then start adding the members into those groups. And when I add those members, they can also be Active Directory security groups as well, which makes sense because then we can have a single place to remove users should they leave the organization and so on. So that's changed now. If we just flip into my SharePoint Online environment and click Create Site, what I can do is choose between a communication site and a team site. And if I opt for a team site and give this a name, so I'm just going to call this Permissions Webinar Demo. Okay, so when I create this team site, it says that the site name is available and also the group email address is available. And there's my site address. So notice it's creating it really as a top level site under the sites node. And we can give it a description and so on. When I click next, it then asks me to add additional owners and members. Now, when I go through to add additional owners, I could add, obviously, somebody else is going to have effectively full control to the site. So I'll jump down here to members. Now, I have an Active Directory security group that I want to use, which is called Sales Group. And notice when I type in Sales Group that it's not able to accept that. and it does exist, trust me. So I'm just going to remove that for a moment. You can see that it's not actually allowing me to add this Active Directory security group. So I'll click on to finish, and my new site will be spun up, and it will look wonderful and modern. And I'm a huge fan of the new look and feel of the modern team site. But what I want to do is show you how some of these things have changed around permissions management. So when we click onto the cog in the top right hand corner now, and notice that there is no link to site settings, we have to get there through site information. So we can click onto site information here, and then there's the view all site settings. And as I click into that view all site settings, notice what's missing from the top left is that ability to go through and have a look at the site permissions. It's been obscured. So let's just hit back for a moment. In fact, there was no need to hit back, sorry. In the cog in the top right, again, I can select that. And in there is, of course, the site permissions, which you may have already seen. So as I click onto site permissions, I've got the ability to invite people. And it shows me who's got permissions already. So there's just that site owners group, there's the site members group. So when I go to invite people, it says I can add members to the group or share the site only. So what's actually happening here is this SharePoint team site is actually, it's what's known as a groupified site. It's a Office 365 group. So that Office 365 group is not just SharePoint. It's a group that we can use throughout pretty much the whole of Office 365. And yeah, I could add members to that group and they'll be able to get involved with everything inside that group, including Microsoft Teams and everything else. Or I've got the ability to share just the site. So if I go to add members to the group, again, when I click on to add members, I have no ability to add my Active Directory security group, but I can, let's just close that for a moment. If I go back to site permissions, invite people and choose share the site only. So they won't be added to the Office 365 group, but now I can select that sales group. So I can choose my Active Directory security group. It's nested in there. Notice it's getting edit permissions, and I can click add. And now I've got users that are able to access this site via that AD group. So that's changed. I still have the link here to the advanced permission settings. That's no longer on the site settings. I can get to the advanced permission settings, and suddenly I feel all warm and comfortable because I've got this nice classic view back. But notice what's happened here. We've got the three groups that got created, the three SharePoint groups, and if I go into the members group there, I can see that I've got my Office 365 group, and I've also got the Active Directory security group. But clicking onto that Active Directory security group, same problem that we've always had. You can't see who's a member of it. That's impossible to see that. Okay, so the way that we're looking at permissions, when we spun up that site, there was no concern about where did it get created. I just created the new site. It's now a flat hierarchy. What we do have the ability to do is associate it with another site, which we can do here from the site settings. Sorry, from the site information panel. I guess I need to go back home before I can see that. So up here on the cog, if we go back to site information, and yeah, I've got the hub site association. So in the drop down here, I've got a number of different hub sites, and I can associate this site with that hub site, which gives it navigation inherited from the hub site, and also the theme can also be can come across from the hub site, and news is rolled up, and a number of other things that we can go through. But you can see how there's no concern about where that site is going to be created. Now what that means is there's less of an inheritance issue. So we don't have to make that decision anymore. When we're creating that new team site, we don't have to say, is this going to inherit permissions or is it going to have unique permissions? It just has unique permissions, full stop. But there's less of a risk in SharePoint site collections when we go to add a user to a site. This is the other problem with the share button. When we share permissions with a particular SharePoint team site, somebody goes in it, there could be 100 other sites that all use the same groups. So you intended to give permissions to a user to one team site when in fact they just received permissions to hundreds of sites by being a member of that group. So there's not that issue anymore. You go into an Office 365 group and that's it. You get that permissions to that one team site and that's it. There's more emphasis on the Office 365 groups, as you've seen, and I think you can also hopefully agree with me here. There's a discouragement to actually use Active Directory security groups. So yeah, you can share just the site with those AD security groups, but really we're being encouraged to use Office 365 groups, which if we consider it, how much of a problem is that going to come? How many SharePoint sites do you have inside your environment today that inherit permissions and inherit groups? And now for every single one of those sites, we're going to have some Office 365 groups, and that also could become a problem when we start looking at needle in a haystack scenario. We want to make sure that we can remove somebody in one go from all of these Office 365 groups. Okay, and of course there's a new permissions interface as well. Have a play around with it. If you go into your lists and libraries, you'll see that getting to the permissions page has also changed there as well. So let's have a look at what DeliverPoint can help with regards to some of these pain points. The first thing I want to look at is really permissions management reporting for the content owner. So take off our IT pro hats for a moment. This is the business user that we're talking about. So I'll start off in SharePoint on premises, and we will also have a look at SharePoint Online as well. Actually, they're exactly the same reports and style. So here we are, we've got a SharePoint team site in SharePoint 2016, and what I'm going to do is come down here to site settings. So when we go to site settings, we can go into that site permissions that we were referring to that's now been hidden in the modern sites. And we've got the yellow banner that's explaining whether this site inherits permissions or whether it has unique permissions. And I've also got my SharePoint groups here. They've all been assigned a permission level to this site. And as I go into those SharePoint groups, we can see the members, and we've also got the Active Directory security group here called LT/sales, which again, when I click onto that, I can't enumerate. So when we're looking at these groups, we've got to go digging into each group, and we're going to see nested groups that we can't go into, and so on. It's difficult to actually see everybody who's got permissions. So as the content owner, as the site owner, what I can do is click onto that cog again in the top right and discover the site permissions. So I don't have to go outside of the SharePoint environment. This is not something that's designed specifically for the farm admin. The farm admin can use this. There's elements of DeliverPoint that the farm admin can certainly use, but this bit here is designed around the business user and that site owner. So here we have a full list of everybody that's got permissions on this site. Users that have full control and edit, contribute, read, and so on. And there's 3 pages of users that we certainly didn't get that impression when we were looking at the site settings inside of this team site. So if we take a user, we can see Amelia here. She has edit permissions to this particular team site. And as we scroll to the right, we can see that she's a member of the sales team members group. And if I expand that sales team members group, I can see that that particular instance she is a member of directly. So she's just inside that SharePoint group. But here she is again with edit permissions. And if it's also through the sales team members, now that's not a duplication. She's actually a member of that same group twice, once through an Active Directory security group here called sales, and that's nested inside the SharePoint group. And this happens a lot because somebody who shared permissions with Amelia didn't realize Amelia already had permissions. So it's simply just been shared again. And imagine when Amelia leaves, you may think, oh yeah, I've just taken her out of that group. She's no longer got access, when in fact she does. She's still here inside the AD security group with the same level of permissions. So that allows me to see that information as a content owner. We can filter all of this as well. So if I wanted to focus just on a particular permission level, I can see everybody who's got a particular level of permission. So in here, I'll select edit, for example, and there's then everyone with edit permissions in one view that I can export out to Excel and analyze offline if I want to. I can also schedule it. So if I wanted to have this same report on my desk every week to have a look at what the permissions looks like on my site, then I can do that. So I can choose how and when that's going to be working. And I can also work with the lists and libraries within inside that site as well as a content owner. So think about how many documents or how many folders you might have inside some of your lists and libraries, and how many times has somebody done this? How many times has somebody just clicked share and shared it with another user? And if they've done that, then those documents are going to have broken permission inheritance. So how do you tell which documents have broken permission inheritance and which ones have inherited permissions? That becomes a pain, because now we're adding users to the site and they're not necessarily getting permissions to our documents. So that people are unaware that documents exist, and that becomes an issue. And also, again, if somebody leaves the organization, you're not going to do the 7 or 8 clicks that it takes to get down to the permissions page, which is sort of buried deep in here, and you have to wait for a blue spinny to spin up before you can actually click onto advanced and see the real picture as to who's got permissions to that item. So that's just unrealistic that anybody's going to do that. So what we can do using DeliverPoint is, from the DeliverPoint ribbon, we can first of all have a look at what has broken permission inheritance just by clicking this button, and that will show me everything that has unique permissions. So we have a document and we have a folder that has unique permissions. And from there, we can actually select that folder, and I can select the document, so more than one item at any one time, and go through and discover the permissions on those 2 selected items. So again, saving me a lot of time. If I was interested in a particular user, so in here I'm going to put Brett and hit save. I can now have a look at what permissions Brett has across that folder and the document at the same time. Okay, so that's some of the things that we can do with inside the site. We've also got the ability to manage the permissions as well within there. We can report on everything in one go. So when I go to discover all permissions, I can actually include everything within the site in one report. So that's for all of your lists, libraries, folders, documents, the lot, and filter it out, chop and change it however I want, and also export it out to Excel if I want to. So this will include the lists and items that all have unique permissions, and it will put that into one real-time report for me, so you can see the site permissions and then right down to the item permissions in there. Okay, so that's looking at the business user. What I'm going to do here is go back to the main DeliverPoint dashboard, and this you can also come into as a business user, or you can also come into as a farm admin or a site collection admin, and so on. And it's going to be security trimmed, so you can only change permissions or report on permissions that you can actually you have that permission to do so in the first place. And in my farm here, under sites, I can get into the site collections. So we've got the Contoso one that we're working with here. And this is where we can get a better understanding of permission inheritance. So it's difficult to document what inherits permissions and what has unique permissions because it's changing all the time. Whereas DeliverPoint will just show you. So here in my tree view, I can see that, of course, the top level site has unique permissions. That's in full color, so that it's clear to me that it has unique permissions. Those sites that have inherited permissions have this dimmed icon. So I know just by looking at the tree view that accounts, business data, content aggregation, and forms, they all inherit permissions. Human resources has unique permissions, and R&D, that's inheriting permissions. It's just there visually. Now, if I have a look at human resources, I can see that human resources has a diagonal line through it as well. And what that's telling me is that there's broken permission inheritance somewhere within the site. And notice all the lists and libraries, they all have a dimmed icon. So they're all inheriting permissions, but the employee contracts has a diagonal line through it. So as I select that library and drill into the folders, I can tell exactly where that permission inheritance has been broken, and it's on this folder here called signed contracts. So I don't have to waste time going to the permission reports to see, first of all, whether it inherits permissions or not. Now I can focus my time on managing the permissions where the permission inheritance is set to unique. And one of the things I can do here is also go through and select anything that has unique permissions and compare them. So why are they different? Why are they unique? So what I can do is scroll down those three selected sites, and I can see that actually those three sites all have different permissions. But if they were the same, then my next question might be, well, why are they inheriting? Oh, sorry, why do they have unique permissions? And I could go through and change them to re-inherit all in one go. So we've got the compare. I can also pull up the permission reports here as well. That's the same permission report that you saw before, but it's just allowing me to do it from the tree view and do it on multiple objects at the same time. We can also audit permissions as well. So not only looking at who's got permissions currently, but who changed them. So I can go through and select this entire site collection, click onto audit permissions, and that allows me to see who's changed permissions at any given time. So I've been quite lazy the last week. I've not been changing permissions. So let's just give it a larger window here. And now I can see what permission changes took place within that time frame. So we've got here's a good example of what can happen when you grant permissions to somebody or something. So when we go through and add, in this case, it was granting permissions to a SharePoint group. That may have been done at a particular team site. So you can see it was done by the system account on the sales team. So that was the scope at where it was changed, but it actually affected all of these other sites that inherit permissions as well. So it was unintended that we gave that SharePoint group permissions to all of these other sites. So we can see that that's granted. We can see that these ones are permissions that have been removed, and we can see what permission inheritance changes there has been. So who changed the inheritance and at what scope did they change it. And then we've also got the group membership changes at the bottom here as well. So I can see if people are added or removed from different SharePoint groups, all of that gets recorded. So that's auditing permissions. And another thing I can do is actually be alerted to the fact that permissions have changed. So as I click the drop down here, I can select Alert Me, and this will tell me of something that changes. And you can see I've got an alert already set up here that says somebody was granted full control. Tell me immediately. It's going to email me, Brett, and that's the permission that it's monitoring. So if anybody gets full control, I get an alert to say somebody got full control. So I can click onto New Alert to start monitoring something else. So maybe we've got a new site collection administrator that we've put on a training course on how to be a site collection administrator, and maybe their name is Bob. So we'll say monitor Bob, and we can send alerts again to Brett, and we'll monitor any permission change that Bob makes, and here we can change or specify who that change initiator is. So it's LT/Bob. So if Bob changes something with regards to permissions, it tells me. We could monitor permission level, name, patterns, or we could also monitor members as well. So if it's a certain person that you don't want to have permissions, or a certain organizational unit in your Active Directory that you don't want to have permissions, then we can basically specify what the expression is, and it will tell us if that happens. And we hit create, and that rule will be then in place. Okay, so that's the monitoring. What happens if somebody leaves the organization? Well, what we can do here is go and have a look at a individual. So I'm going to do a search here for Amelia. So let's search on her account. So here's Amelia. We can select Amelia, and then I can have a look at unique permissions. So I've not specified a scope. This is actually going to be at farm level. So just take a moment, and we should have the full report coming back on Amelia. Okay, so here it is. I can first of all see what Active Directory groups Amelia is a member of. So pretty important if Amelia is going to be changing roles. I know what Active Directory groups to take her out of. I've also got all the SharePoint groups that Amelia is a member of, and I can see how she's a member of them, whether it's through an Active Directory security group or whether it's direct. And as we scroll down, I can also see Amelia is a site collection admin. That's a problem. So I don't want to just remove Amelia if she's a site collection admin, because that will orphan my site collection. And also I've got the site permissions that she has. And as we keep scrolling down, the list permissions and the item permissions. So I've got it all in one report. And what I can decide now is, well, if she's going to be leaving the organization, if she's being replaced, does somebody else need to have these permissions? Now, maybe, but maybe not all of them. So what I can do is expand Amelia, come down to, I'll ignore the my stuff. We don't want to give that to somebody else. So I can just maybe select the sites managed path and the root site collection or something like that. And I could transfer permissions at that level. So anything that falls under that, I want to transfer the permissions away from Amelia and go ahead and give them to somebody else. And I can execute that now. So I'll do that. And choose OK. Now what will be affected is any direct permissions and any SharePoint group memberships. Active Directory security group membership doesn't get changed, but what we can do is still see what groups Amelia is a member of, and that's then down to the Active Directory administrator to remove her from those groups. We don't change those deliberately. So as I go into the job status, we can go through and see that these jobs have been scheduled. So you can see it's quite often I transfer from Rio to Amelia and Amelia to Rio and so on. So these two jobs are pending. So they will take place every 5 minutes. So let's have a look at a previous one. I can go through and view the job and see if anything took place. So actually in that instance, nothing took place, but probably it did on the one before. It looked like it was a duplicate job of sorts. So let me just have a look at this one. Nothing there either, but that's quite possible. There was nothing to change. Maybe Amelia already had the same permissions. But otherwise, we see a list of all of the jobs that did take place, and then we could also roll that back. So maybe if we selected the wrong Amelia or something like that, we can put it back to how it was, which can be done in just one go. So that's how we can go through and transfer permissions. We can also copy permissions as well. So if Amelia's maybe not leaving, Rio is going to be joining her, then I can just simply copy the permissions from Rio to Amelia. And I can also go through and set up template accounts. So I could, for example, have a salesperson account, give it all the permissions that it needs, and every time I need to onboard a new salesperson, I just copy the permissions from the salesperson account to the new salesperson, and they'll get all of the permissions that they need all in one go. Now, granting permissions is something else that we can do, and when we grant permissions, one advantage that we've got here is you can select multiple objects that you want to grant permissions to in one go, make the user a member of SharePoint groups or give them permissions directly, and we can also specify a temporary permission. So if you've got perhaps somebody that's a contractor going to be joining your company for a fixed length of time, so just 3 months or a week or whatever it might be, we can go and grant them permissions for that period of time, and then DeliverPoint will automatically revoke those permissions at the end of that time. So that's something we can do when we're granting. We also have here dead accounts. So dead account reporting is a really useful feature. So if we've got somebody that is no longer with the organization, their Active Directory account was either disabled or deleted, then one of the problems is that they quite often still show up as having permissions inside of SharePoint. Now, they can't do anything because they can't authenticate, but they do still show up inside these permission reports. So with that in mind, what we can do is run a dead account report, select the account, and just simply go through and delete it, and that will delete them as a site collection user, which will take them out of any SharePoint groups, take away the direct permissions, and they will stop showing up inside the people picker, which is very useful. Okay, and just a couple of things left here in on-prem, and we'll have a quick look at online as well. So in SharePoint on-premise, we can copy site permissions, list permissions, and item permissions. So this is about copying not from one user to another or from a group to another. This is about copying an entire permission set from one site to another site. So if you want to clone a permission set from one site to another, you can do that using the copy site permissions, which, if you think about how SharePoint Online is moving, where you've got this flat hierarchy and there's no longer inheritance, that's really useful to be able to say, yeah, okay, I've set all these permissions up on this particular site. I want this other site to have the same permission setup, and being able to clone it across there. So the only other thing to point out is another feature that you can do in DeliverPoint on-prem is to also set up DeliverPoint auditors. And this is a challenge when you've got a help desk that's maybe responsible for permission reporting, but you don't necessarily want to give that help desk permissions to your content because it's of a personal nature or it's confidential. But SharePoint doesn't cater for that. You have to give them full control in order to manage permissions. DeliverPoint does. You can add somebody as a auditor and they can run a permission report on anything regardless of their own permissions. They may not be able to access the content, but they can report on the permission list. And we can also do the same for operators as well. So if you want somebody to assign permissions through the copy, transfer, delete, then they can do that if you give them access to do so. And again, they could do that without actually having access to the content themselves. So just having a look at SharePoint Online, we can go into SharePoint Online here, and the way that SharePoint Online can use DeliverPoint is almost the same. So the only difference here is that it's packaged as a DeliverPoint add-in. As a SharePoint add-in. So I can go into the add-in, and this allows me to see the same thing, only at site collection scope. So what we can do here is drill down into our site collection. We can still see those sites that have unique permissions and inherited permissions and so on. We can select those sites and we can discover the permissions in exactly the same way. So we get to see everybody that's been permissioned, even if it's through an Active Directory security group. So in here, if we expand some of these, you can see that they are all, in that case, directly a member of these SharePoint groups. Here's an example of one that's through an Active Directory or an Azure Active Directory security group. So we get the nesting in exactly the same way. So you can see how those permissions are assigned, and you can filter, sort, and do everything exactly the same way as you did in SharePoint on-prem. You can also perform each of the operations, so the copy, grant, transfer, delete permissions. You can change the inheritance as you can. You can also compare permissions in the same way, so we can learn what's different across those sites. We can check a user's permissions, so we can do the unique permissions report that you saw, so we can have a look at what groups this user is a member of and what site permissions they've been granted, and so on. And we also have the dead account report as well, that we just saw. And on that, we've also got the external users capability. So obviously that doesn't apply to SharePoint on premises, but if I bring back a user permission report, one of the users here I have is Alan Lonsdale. So there's Alan Lonsdale, and if I click onto external users, you can see that Alan Lonsdale is in fact an external user. So when I go to the account view and look at Alan Lonsdale, I can have a look at what unique permissions he has, because when we share during a site collection with an external user, the same thing happens. You may think you're giving them permissions to just a site, but in actual fact you're making them a member of a group, and by making them a member of that group, they could also then therefore be granted permissions to lots of other sites as well. So this is a great way of having a look at what your external users are granted permissions to. Okay, so a lot of the other features are the same as SharePoint on-prem. So I just wanted to sort of show you it in both environments. So hopefully you've seen how we can address a lot of those pain points through the content owners having the ability to have more powerful reporting and being able to see everybody that's got permissions. We've also got the bulk management of permissions, so the granting, copying, transferring, deleting. You don't have to do these things on a object by object basis. We can see who changed permissions. We can be alerted to the fact that permissions are changing, and also we can see the dead accounts, the people that have perhaps left our organization. Okay, so that was the demonstration. Kind of did that backwards. Just also very proud. This is a product that we've been developing for quite a long time now. It was available in SharePoint 2003, as well as 2007, 2010, 2013, 2016, and online. And it's been recognized by the European SharePoint community for the awards in Copenhagen, which is taking place in a couple of weeks. So this is the European SharePoint conference, and DeliverPoint is among, I think it's 4 other management solutions for SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint online. So fingers crossed we might win that, but yeah, it's great to also be a finalist for the best management solution. So what happens now? Well, hopefully you've got a good taster of what the product can do for you, and hopefully also learned something about SharePoint permissions along the way. There is some extra things for you. If you wanted to have a more detailed demonstration, you can either drop us an email, or there is actually a form online that you can fill out. So it's lightningtools.com/demonstration-request. I've also got a SharePoint 2016 permissions guide that I wrote, and that's you don't have to sign up to our newsletter or anything like that in order to get it. Just the best way to find that is Google it. It's one of the first results. So if you just Google SharePoint 2016 permissions guide, you'll have a document talking about all the best practices around managing permissions, and it's not anything to do with DeliverPoint. It's hopefully going to be just a useful guide for you with regards to SharePoint 2016 and permissions there. There's also a 14-day trial of the product, so you can download that. both for SharePoint on-prem and online. Also, if you want to get in touch with me by email, that's brett@lightningtools.com, so you can email me there. Other than that, I'm going to open up now for questions. And I'll just also point out that you can see our upcoming webinars. So if you enjoyed this one, there's some other webinars. So if you go to lightningtools.com/webcast/new-webinar-series, if you can't remember that, just go on to lightningtools.com, click webcasts, and you'll see it right at the very top. You can get there, and there's a number of different webinars that I'll be doing around SharePoint list forms tomorrow. So this is the Lightning Forms product and how you can customize lists and library forms. So great if you're thinking of retiring InfoPath. So another way to build in forms. And then we've also got 3 brand new SharePoint framework tools. The content rollup web part, the Lightning Conductor, also the data viewer, and our discussion forum tool as well. That's taking place next week, so you can sign up for those events if they're of interest to you. And I'll just flick back to this slide so you can take down my email address if you need it. So I'm going to open up for questions. So remember, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. There's the raise hand button inside GoToWebinar, and I will then unmute you and you can ask your question. Not seeing any raised hands just yet. No raised hands. So, okay, I'll assume that I answered what questions you have. But also, if you don't want to ask your question in the GoToWebinar, remember you can just drop me an email. So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions via that. Also, I want to point out that this webinar was recorded. So if you want to watch it back, or you've got a colleague that missed it or something like that, then get onto that webcast page tomorrow. So lightningtools.com, click onto webcasts, and you'll see the recording there. And I think you also get an email with a link to the recording as well. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I hope you found it useful, and hopefully see you guys on another webinar very shortly.